I think it's worth going into some detail about how the evolution of ECCE funding has happened and what inflation has been doing in the meantime. It's generally a poorly understood point about how the funding for this part of the sector has evolved. So let's just go through it. We'll take a quick look at free, I say free, quote unquote, free preschool funding versus inflation. It's free to parents, of course, but providers are at this point subsidising the government on ECCE, so that's why we say free in inverted commas. The axis on the left here is the Consumer Price Index. It's a proxy for inflation, and the axis on the right is the funding for ECCE. So just to say, from September 2010 we had standard capitation, and it moved down a little bit when we had some fiscal issues in the country, and it was nudged up here and there. And in September 2018, just to point out this step up here, the capitation, both types of capitation, standard and higher, were raised by 7% to address inflationary and funding pressures at the time. So higher capitation is there as well. For any service that has a graduate-led session, higher capitation is available to all children registered to that session. Viability problems have existed for many, many years. The squeeze has been slow. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where it started, but certainly it has been there for several years, and it is really at a crunch point now, as we know. And just to point out that partially to address this and to look at the amount of administration that was being done in services to administer the various programs, so NCS, the ECCE scheme itself and all the rest of it, the program support payment was introduced as an addition. It was very welcome. It's important to say that it was very welcome, but it was also grossly insufficient, and it was devoured by inflation. I'll come to that in a minute. Core funding has on the kind of basic core funding. Then there's some graduate premium where that's relevant, and for any service for whom that doesn't make up the exact amount that they were already on, the government will add on a little slip at the end there. The point being that nobody is at a loss. So this is a basic pure ECCE session you're looking at, this pricing, this funding, I should say. So let's just take a little look at inflation and what it's been doing across the course of this time. And you can see since 2010 it's been rising, certainly rising gradually, but certainly you would say across those years, until a point when viability problems within the sector started to creep in. And then you had the step up in the capitation levels, which I mentioned, the 7% increase here in September 2018. And what happened after that was that inflation just kept rising and basically devoured any benefit that would have been there from that increase and the PSP payment, which had been introduced previously. And then we know what happened next. I mean, coming into 2020, there was initially a dip and then an absolutely enormous spike in inflation, which continues today. And it really has been a very, very difficult picture in terms of the cost base for sessions across the country. And you might say, well, look, if viability was so bad and the problems were so common, and inflation was just so enormous and difficult to cope with, well, why didn't a bunch of services just close down then in September 2020 if things were that bad? Surely they were still making money. The answer is no. ECCE sessions were not suddenly viable for some reason in 2020. EWSS was an enormous shot in the arm to the industry, to the sector, I should say, and it underpinned viability for services who otherwise would have closed during 2020. So it was just an enormous amount of money, straight up, but a huge support and a very, very welcome relief for the time that it was there. But it's gone now. And we're back to a situation where we've been put back on 2018 funding, or near the 2018 funding levels, because I don't want to say it's zero in all cases. It's not. In most cases there is something there from core funding, but it's grossly insufficient. We don't know where inflation is going. We believe that capitation should be much higher than where it is. And I just want to again point out that under core funding, services are in receipt of amounts that are not quite exactly where they were in 2018. The point of this slide is just to explain that they need to be much higher than where they are in order to cope with inflation. Simple as that. At the end of the day, the very simple picture, you've got funding staying where it is or close to where it has been for the last several years, and you've got costs rising, and that's just untenable.